there is a name that has never truly left us. Through 3,000 years of war and empire, of fallen kingdoms and forgotten gods, through the slow erosion of civilizations that believed themselves eternal, one name has endured, carved into temple walls, whispered in ancient olive groves, painted onto pottery, woven into the stars themselves. A name that belongs to no single culture, and yet has been claimed by all of them. That name is Hercules, or, if you prefer the older tongue, Heracles, son of Zeus, the divine made flesh, a being who walked the earth with the full weight of Olympus in his bloodline and the full burden of humanity in his heart. He was not a god. He was not merely a man. He existed in the breathless space between those two things, and it was precisely that tension, that beautiful, agonizing contradiction, that made him the most compelling figure the ancient world ever produced. Pause for a moment and consider what that truly meant. To be born of a god was to carry power beyond comprehension. The strength that lived inside Hercules was not the strength of a warrior honed by years of training, though he was that too. It was something older and stranger, something that allowed him, as an infant of 8 months, to reach into his cradle with his tiny hands and crush 2 serpents, sent by the goddess Hera herself to kill him before he ever drew his second breath. This was not a man who became powerful. This was a man who was born into power so vast that even the gods who hated him feared what he could become. And Hera did hate him, deeply, completely. Not because of anything Hercules himself had done, but because of what he represented, the living evidence of her husband Zeus's infidelity. Every time she looked upon Hercules, she saw a wound that would not close. And so she spent the whole of his life attempting to break him. She drove him to madness. She placed obstacles in his path that would have destroyed lesser beings entirely. She orchestrated the most crushing moment of his life, and indirectly, in doing so, gave birth to his greatest legend. Because it was Hera's cruelty that led to the 12 labors, in a moment of divine-induced madness that Hercules would spend the rest of his days in grief over. He committed an act so terrible that no ordinary penance could balance it, and so the oracle at Delphi, that strange, smoke-filled voice of Apollo, handed down a sentence. He would enter the service of his cousin, King Eurystheus of Tiryns. He would complete 12 tasks, each one chosen specifically to be impossible, each one designed not merely to test his strength, but to humiliate him, to destroy him, or to simply demonstrate once and for all that there were limits even a demigod could not surpass. There were not. He strangled the Nemean lion with his bare hands, a beast whose hide no weapon could pierce, and wore its skin as his armor ever after. He faced the Lenaean Hydra, a creature that grew 2 heads for every one that was cut away, and found a solution elegant in its brutal simplicity. He captured the golden hind of Artemis, an animal so sacred and so swift that merely chasing it took him an entire year. He cleaned the Augean stables, 30 years of accumulated filth, in a single day, by redirecting 2 rivers. He captured the Cretan bull. He stole the mares of Diomedes, flesh-eating horses fed on human blood. He journeyed to the very edge of the world, to the garden of the Hesperides, and retrieved the golden apples guarded there. And finally, he descended into the underworld itself, into Hades, and returned carrying Cerberus, the 3-headed guardian of the dead, with nothing more than his hands and his will. He did all of this, and he survived. But the labors are only the beginning of who Hercules was. They are the headline, not the story. The story is richer and stranger and more human than most people realize, because between those famous tasks and long after them, Hercules sailed with the Argonauts on their hunt for the Golden Fleece. He founded cities. He wrestled death itself, the god Thanatos, to save a friend's wife from the underworld. He held up the sky in the place of Atlas. He crossed the world in the cup of the sun god Helios. He founded the Olympic Games by some ancient accounts. He was betrayed, he was loved, he was broken and rebuilt more times than any story has room to count. He was, in ways that still resonate deeply, recognizably human, prone to grief, prone to rage, capable of extraordinary tenderness and catastrophic violence, sometimes in the same breath. He drank too much. He wept openly. He loved fiercely and lost terribly. And, through all of it, he kept moving forward. Not because he was fearless, but because he was resolute. That is what we will explore together in the hours ahead. Not just the deeds, though those are spectacular enough to hold us for a long while, but the man, the myth, the meaning, why the ancient Greeks needed him so deeply, and why we, 3,000 years removed from the olive groves where his stories were first told, still cannot seem to let him go. 5 chapters remain, and we have all the time in the world. Time a vowel of vi, nime of I. It is the story of the exceptional child born into impossible circumstances, the child whose very existence upsets the natural order of things, whose arrival into the world is not a quiet, ordinary event, but something closer to a disturbance, a crack in the fabric of what is supposed to be. Hercules was that child, but to understand him fully, to understand why his birth mattered, why it threatened an entire pantheon of gods, why a goddess of marriage and fidelity declared a war of attrition against a newborn, we must first go back to the mountain, back to Olympus, back to the particular weakness of the king of the gods and the chain of events it set irreversibly in motion. Zeus was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful being in existence. He commanded the sky and the storm. He held the thunderbolt. He had overthrown his own father, the Titan Cronus, and divided the cosmos amongst his siblings like a conquered territory. The sea to Poseidon, the underworld to Hades, the earth and the heavens, the bright, breathing world to himself. He sat upon his throne at the peak of Olympus, and nothing, in theory, could touch him. In practice, however, Zeus had a particular and well-documented vulnerability where beautiful mortal women were concerned. This is not a detail the myths shy away from. Greek mythology is, if nothing else, honest about the shortcomings of its gods. And Zeus, magnificent, sovereign, unconquerable Zeus, was constitutionally incapable of keeping his divine attention where his divine wife expected it to remain. Hera knew this. She had always known it, and she had developed, over the long centuries of their marriage, an elaborate internal architecture of patience and fury, acceptance and resentment that expressed itself not in direct confrontation with her husband, who was, after all, essentially omnipotent, but in very targeted action against the objects of his affection and the children who resulted from them. She was, in this particular regard, extraordinarily methodical. And then came Alcmene. Alcmene was a mortal woman of Thebes, and by all accounts she was remarkable in ways that extended well beyond her beauty. She was the granddaughter of Perseus, himself already a figure of legend, the slayer of Medusa, a hero whose bloodline was already dense with divine inheritance. She was renowned for her intelligence, her loyalty, and a personal code of virtue so strict that even the gods apparently found it noteworthy. She was married to a Theban king named Amphitryon, whom she loved genuinely and completely. Zeus wanted her, and being Zeus, he devised a plan that was, depending on your perspective, either brilliantly cunning or deeply unconscionable. While Amphitryon was away at war, Zeus came to Alcmene in the form of her husband. He extended that single night into the length of 3 ordinary nights, commanding the sun itself to stay below the horizon, so that what passed between them might be something more than a brief deception. He came to her not as a conqueror, but as a husband, or at least as a perfect imitation of one. And when Amphitryon returned the very next day, genuinely confused by the warmth with which his wife greeted him as though he had already been home, the mathematics of the situation quietly arranged themselves. Alcmene was pregnant, twice over in a sense, for she carried within her 2 children from 2 fathers, the god's son and the king's son. Iphicles would be born alongside Hercules, his twin in almost every way except the most important one. Where Iphicles was fully human, mortal, and ordinary in his capabilities, Hercules carried something else entirely, something that even in the womb apparently announced itself. Because Hera knew, she always knew. The manner of her interference began before the birth, and it is one of the more telling details in the whole mythology because it reveals something important about the nature of the conflict. This was not a battle between equals. Hera could not simply destroy Hercules, not directly, not easily, not in ways that would be clean or final. What she could do was manipulate, delay, scheme. She sent the goddess of childbirth, Eileithyia, to Alcmene's bedside with instructions to delay the labor indefinitely, to keep the child from entering the world. She sat outside the chamber with her legs crossed and her fingers interlaced, a posture of magical prevention, holding back the birth through divine obstruction. This might have worked. It nearly did. But a mortal servant named Galanthus, loyal to Alcmene and sharp enough to understand that something was wrong, tricked Eileithyia with a sudden, startling announcement that the baby had already been born. The goddess, in her surprise, uncrossed her fingers, broke her posture, and the magic collapsed. Alcmene's labor resumed. Hercules arrived in the world, loudly and approximately on time, while Eileithyia and Hera seethed. The goddess of divine childbirth was furious enough that she transformed Galanthus into a weasel. This tells you something about the proportionality of divine reactions in ancient mythology. But the servant's sacrifice and the child's arrival was done. He was in the world now, and he was magnificent from the very beginning. The name his mother gave him at birth was Alcides. Hercules, or Heracles, came later, and the etymology of it is one of the quietly ironic threads woven through his entire story. Heracles. It means, roughly, glory of Hera. The greatest hero the ancient world would ever know was named in honor of the goddess who hated him most. Some scholars suggest this was an attempt at appeasement, a naming ritual designed to soften the goddess's enmity by making the child a living tribute to her. If so, it failed entirely. Others suggest the name accumulated around him like sediment over generations, an acknowledgement that his very existence, his survival against her persistent opposition, was itself a kind of tribute to her power, if an ironic one. Whatever its origin, the name stuck, traveled west into Rome as Hercules, and then traveled forward through the rest of recorded history until it became the word we reach for instinctively when we want to describe something that requires extraordinary strength. Herculean effort, Herculean task. The adjective outlived the mythology that produced it by centuries and is still in daily use today. But back to the child. The infant Hercules was, in the custom of the time, placed in a ceremonial shield to sleep. A tradition among heroes, a kind of martial cradle that announced the child's destiny as clearly as any prophecy. And it was there, in that shield, in the deep and innocent dark of his first months of life, that Hera made her first direct attempt on his life. She sent 2 serpents. The ancient sources differ slightly on the details, whether they were sent at night, whether they glowed with some divine light, whether one entered from each side of the room, but the essential image is consistent and unforgettable. 2 enormous snakes, moving through the dark toward a sleeping infant. Iphicles woke first and screamed, as any human child would and should. The servants ran. Amphitryon ran. Everyone rushed toward the sound of the infant's terror. And they found Hercules sitting up in the shield, 1 serpent in each of his tiny hands, both of them already dead. He was 8 months old. He looked up at the adults flooding into the room with what the ancient poet Pindar described as an expression of entirely unconcerned curiosity. He appeared to find the whole affair rather interesting. The snakes, once instruments of divine assassination, had become toys. He held them out, apparently to show the adults what he had found. Amphitryon, to his great credit, understood immediately that this was not a normal child. He summoned the seer Tiresias, that extraordinary blind prophet of Thebes, who appears throughout Greek mythology at precisely the moments when the most difficult truths need to be spoken. And Tiresias laid it all out plainly: the child's parentage, the goddess's enmity, the life that was coming, the trials that would define it, the glory that would eventually follow. He did not soften any of it. That was not what seers were for. And so Alcmene and Amphitryon raised him. They raised them both, Hercules and Iphicles, in the full knowledge of what one of them was and what that meant. They gave him the best teachers available to a Theban prince. Castor, the divine horseman, taught him to ride and to drive a chariot. Autolycus, the master thief, taught him wrestling. Eurytus, one of the greatest archers in the Greek world, taught him the bow, at which Hercules would eventually become almost preternaturally gifted. Linus, the musician and scholar, was brought in to teach him the lyre and letters. The lyre lesson did not end well. Linus, by various accounts, was a demanding and not particularly patient teacher. He corrected Hercules sharply one day. The specific provocation varies depending on which ancient source you follow, and Hercules, in a burst of adolescent frustration that carried, unfortunately, the full physical force of a demigod, struck his music teacher with the lyre. Linus died. Hercules, horrified at himself, was subsequently acquitted of any crime on the grounds that he had been provoked. An early and somewhat uncomfortable application of what we might today call proportional response doctrine. But Amphitryon, perhaps wisely, decided that the time had come to move the boy to a safer environment. He sent him to the countryside, to the mountains of Cithaeron, to tend cattle. It seems an odd choice for a demigod in training, but there was wisdom in it. Physical labor, space, the company of animals rather than people who could be accidentally killed. It was there, in those years of relative solitude, that Hercules grew into his body and his power with some degree of control, that he learned, in the patient, unglamorous way that mountains teach, the difference between strength and violence. It was also there, at roughly 18 years of age, that he killed his first real monster, the lion of Cithaeron, a great beast that had been ravaging the herds of the surrounding villages. He killed it with his bare hands, as he would kill all his most significant opponents, and he returned from the kill wearing its skin, not yet the famous Nemean lion skin that would become his defining image, but a rehearsal for it, a first draft of the icon he was becoming. Shortly after this, he performed his first great act of heroism on behalf of others, rescuing the city of Thebes from the domination of the Minyans of Orchomenus, a neighboring kingdom that had imposed a humiliating annual tribute on the Thebans. Hercules, with a ferocity and military brilliance that stunned both sides of the conflict, not only defeated the Minyan army, but cut off the ears and noses of the minion ambassadors who had come to collect the tribute. A deliberately outrageous insult designed to end the relationship entirely. It worked. The minions were broken. Thebes was free. In gratitude, the king of Thebes, Creon, gave Hercules his daughter, Megara, in marriage. And here, the story pauses for just a moment and asks us to pay attention to something quieter and more tender than dragon slaying or serpent strangling. Because by all accounts, Hercules loved Megara genuinely and completely. They built a life together. They had children. The ancient sources give different numbers, ranging from 3 to 8, depending on which tradition is followed. Hercules was, for a time, not a hero in motion, but a husband at rest, a father at home. He was happy in the uncomplicated, almost ordinary way that happiness sometimes finds even extraordinary people. He was, briefly, at peace, which is precisely when Hera struck again. Not with serpents this time, not with monsters or trials or divine obstruction. With something far crueler and far more precise, she reached into the mind of Hercules, into the seat of his reason and his love and his recognition, and she took it away from him. She drove him mad. In the blindness of that divinely inflicted insanity, Hercules killed his children. Some accounts include Megara, some spare her. All of them agree on the essential horror of what occurred, and all of them agree on what Hercules found when the madness lifted and he understood, fully and irreversibly, what his own hands had done. He found that he was still alive, that he would have to go on living, that no amount of grief or horror or self-recrimination would undo a single moment of it. That is the wound at the center of the Hercules story. That is what the 12 labors were built around. Not a punishment exactly, but an attempt to make meaning out of something that resisted meaning entirely, to build something lasting and redemptive out of the wreckage of the worst moment of a man's life. He would spend the rest of his years attempting to answer the question that morning left him with: whether it was possible, whether it was ever truly possible, to earn back something that had been so completely, so catastrophically lost. You and Sai, they are for-e, they are for. They are far, they are for reeled and very old and very human about the idea of the impossible task. Every culture, in every corner of the world, has produced stories in which a figure of great consequence is given something that cannot be done, and then does it. These stories persist, not because we are naive enough to believe that the impossible is routinely accomplished, but because we are wise enough to understand what the attempt tells us about the person making it. The labor reveals the laborer. What a person chooses to face, and how they face it, is the most honest biography they will ever produce. By that measure, the 12 labors of Hercules are the most comprehensive character study the ancient world ever assembled. But first, the mechanics, the circumstances, the particular humiliation that the king of Tiryns had in mind when he accepted the role of taskmaster to the greatest hero who ever lived. His name was Eurystheus, and he was, in almost every measurable way, the opposite of Hercules. Small, where Hercules was vast. Timid, where Hercules was fearless. Cunning, in the narrow, self-preserving way that small and timid people often are, rather than the bold and creative way that great ones tend to be. He was a king, but the kind of king whose authority rested entirely on the accident of birth and the compliance of those around him. He was also, by a twist of Hera's interference that went all the way back to the night of Hercules' birth, the man whom Zeus had proclaimed High King over all the descendants of Perseus. A title that should, by rights, have gone to Hercules himself. Hera had arranged that too, of course. She had accelerated Eurystheus' birth and delayed Hercules' so that the proclamation fell on the wrong child. It was a manipulation so precise, and so consequential that it shaped the entire structure of Hercules' mortal life. And now, by the oracle's decree, the greatest hero in the world would serve this small and frightened king, would receive his tasks from him, would return to him again and again with things that should have been impossible to bring back. Eurystheus, to his credit, recognized almost immediately that he was in a situation requiring very careful management. When Hercules first arrived at Tiryns and Eurystheus glimpsed through the palace gates the sheer, barely contained enormity of the man who was now technically his servant, he reportedly had a large bronze jar buried in the earth, a vessel he could hide in whenever Hercules returned from a labor. He would issue his commands and receive his reports from behind the palace walls through messengers, rather than face to face with a demigod who had reasons, if he chose to act on them, to feel considerably less than grateful. It was not the most heroic arrangement, but it was a sensible one. The first labor came quickly. The Nemean lion. North of Mycenae, in the valley of Nemea, a lion had been killing, not in the ordinary way of predators, methodically, selectively, for food, but with a kind of indiscriminate ferocity that suggested something beyond animal hunger. The Nemean lion was, by all ancient accounts, divine in origin. Some said it had fallen from the moon. Some said it was the offspring of the monster, Typhon, and the serpent, Echidna, that dark couple who produced so many of the great antagonists of Greek mythology. Whatever its origin, the result was the same. A creature of extraordinary size, an entirely impenetrable hide. No weapon could pierce it. No arrow, no spear, no sword. This was not metaphor. This was the specific structural problem that Hercules had to solve before he could kill it. Because the ordinary tools of violence, the tools that had served every other hero before him, were simply irrelevant here. He tried the arrows first. He was an extraordinary archer, trained by one of the best in the Greek world, and the arrows flew true. They bounced off. He tried the sword. It bent against the lion's hide as if striking stone. He tried the spear, and the spear shattered. The lion, apparently untroubled by any of this, turned and began moving toward him. And so Hercules did what Hercules did when the tools of civilization failed. He used his hands. He drove the lion into its cave, blocking one entrance himself, cornering the animal, and in the darkness of that narrow space he wrestled it. He locked his arms around its neck and he squeezed, with the full and terrible force of his divine inheritance, until the lion stopped moving. There was no elegance to it, no cleverness, no trick, no particular strategy beyond the straightforward application of strength that no mortal and very few immortals could match. He simply held on, and the lion died. Then came the next problem. He needed to skin it, to take that invulnerable hide for his own use, which he had already understood would be the only armor equal to the challenges ahead, but no blade could cut it. He solved this with a practicality that is quietly one of the most satisfying details in all of Hercules' mythology. He used the lion's own claws. The one thing sharp enough to penetrate the hide was the hide's own natural weaponry. He skinned the Nemean lion with the Nemean lion, draped its pelt across his shoulders, and walked back to Tiryns wearing it. Eurystheus hid in the jar. The second labor was more complex, more disturbing, more revealing of just how carefully the tasks had been chosen to expose the specific limits of what strength alone could accomplish. The Lernaean Hydra lived in the swamps near Lerna, a 9-headed serpent of monstrous size whose breath alone was poisonous enough to kill anyone who breathed it without protection. Hercules arrived with his nephew Iolaus as a companion, covered his mouth and nose against the poison, and began to fight. He swung his sword. He cut off a head, and watched, with the particular and sinking feeling of a man who has just realized the rules have changed, as 2 heads grew back in its place. This is the labor that most clearly illustrates the intellectual dimension of Hercules that his popular image sometimes obscures. He was not simply strong. He thought. He adapted. And standing in a Lernaean swamp, watching heads multiply faster than he could remove them, he understood that brute force applied blindly was not going to work here. He needed a different approach. He called to Iolaus. He told him to take a torch and cauterize each neck, to burn the stump immediately after each head was severed, preventing the regeneration. The combination worked. Sword and fire together. Power directed by intelligence. They worked through the heads systematically until only the central immortal head remained, the one that could not be killed by any means. Hercules severed it, buried it beneath an enormous rock at the roadside, and sealed it there permanently. Then he dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood. Those arrows, poisoned with the blood of something that could not die, would follow him for the rest of his life, would kill the centaur, Nessus, decades later, would, through a chain of consequence that Hercules could not possibly have foreseen standing in that swamp, eventually end Hercules himself. Every tool he created was also a weapon pointed, however distantly, back at him. This is a recurring truth in his mythology, and it bears sitting with for a moment. The hero who cannot be killed from outside carries, always, the seeds of his own ending. The third labor was the Cyrenean hind, and it is a fascinating contrast to what came before, because it required Hercules to put his strength almost entirely aside. The hind was sacred to Artemis, goddess of the hunt. It was a deer of supernatural speed, with golden antlers and bronze hooves, and it was beloved of a goddess who would take the killing of it as a profound personal offense. Hercules could not kill it. He could not harm it. He had to catch it, alive and uninjured, and the only way to do that was to follow it until it tired. He followed it for a full year, across mountains, through river valleys, into regions of the world that most men never saw. For 12 months he tracked a single deer across the face of the Greek world, never quite close enough to take it, never willing to give up and return to Tiryns empty-handed. The patience this required, from a man constituted as Hercules was, built for action and resolution, for problems solved with his hands, is genuinely staggering. It is, in its way, more impressive than anything he accomplished through strength. He caught it finally, gently, at a river crossing. He carried it back to Eurystheus, and then released it, having explained his service to Artemis with enough diplomatic precision that the goddess allowed the temporary capture without retribution. The fourth labor, the Erymanthian boar, brought him into contact with the centaurs, those extraordinary creatures, half man and half horse, who populated the wilder regions of the Greek mythological landscape. Hercules stopped at the home of the centaur Pholos during this labor, and the wine that was opened to welcome him was a communal vintage belonging to all the centaurs of the region. The smell of it drew them, furious and territorial, from across the hills. A battle erupted. Hercules fought them off with fire and arrows, his hydra-poisoned arrows, a detail the ancient sources include with quiet consequence. And, in the chaos, his dear friend Chiron, the wisest and most civilized of all centaurs, was accidentally struck. Chiron was immortal and could not die, but the poison of the hydra made the wound perpetually agonizing. He would eventually surrender his immortality to end the suffering. Hercules carried the accidental wounding of Chiron with him, added it to the weight he already carried, kept moving. He cleaned the Argean stables in a single day, a task chosen specifically by Eurystheus for its degrading nature, since it involved the accumulated dung of thousands of cattle over 30 years, a labor of filth rather than glory. Hercules redirected 2 rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, to flow directly through the stables, and the water did in hours what no army of servants could have done in years. When Eurystheus, on a legal technicality, refused to count this labor toward the total, Hercules had been promised payment by King Augeas, and briefly accepted it, making the arrangement contractual rather than penitential. Hercules did not erupt or refuse. He noted the ruling. He moved on. The two labors ultimately not counted by Eurystheus were compensated by two additional ones imposed on top of the original 10, bringing the total to 12. Hercules accepted this too. This patience, this capacity to absorb injustice and continue working, to allow someone smaller and pettier than himself to add to his burden without destroying them for it, is one of the least celebrated but most important qualities the mythology assigns to him. He could have killed Eurystheus at almost any point. He never did. The terms of his service mattered to him. The completion mattered, not the terms under which completion was received. The later labors carried him progressively further from the known world. He fetched the girdle of Hippolyta from the queen of the Amazons, a labor that began in diplomacy and ended in violence through Hera's interference, as so many things did. He stole the cattle of Geryon from the very edge of the Western world, a journey so immense that he marked the boundary of his passage by erecting the Pillars of Hercules. Those two great rocks at the mouth of the Mediterranean that we know today as Gibraltar and Ceuta, as monuments to how far a man could go and still find his way back. He retrieved the golden apples of the Hesperides by holding up the sky. This bears some elaboration, because it is perhaps the most philosophically rich of all the labors. The apples were guarded in a garden at the very edge of the world, tended by the Hesperides, daughters of the evening. Near that garden stood Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold the weight of the heavens on his shoulders for eternity. A punishment so total that it had become simply the nature of his existence. Hercules persuaded Atlas to retrieve the apples himself, offering to take the sky while Atlas was gone. Atlas agreed. Hercules took the weight of the world onto his own shoulders and stood there at the edge of everything, holding the sky up with his hands. Atlas returned with the apples, decided he rather enjoyed not holding the sky, and suggested he might carry the apples to Eurystheus himself, while Hercules remained where he was, permanently. Hercules agreed to this, then asked Atlas to take the sky back for just a moment. He needed to adjust his lion skin as a padding for his shoulders. Atlas set the apples down and took the sky. Hercules picked up the apples and left. It is one of his few victories achieved entirely through cleverness, and it is a reminder that the mythology always knew, even when it surrounded him with impossible physical tasks, that strength without wit is only half the story. The 12th labor brought him to the one place that, until that moment, had no precedent for the living to visit and return. He descended into the underworld, into Hades itself. He passed by the shades of the dead, moved through the darkness of that vast subterranean kingdom, and came at last to the throne of Hades and Persephone. He asked, with every courtesy the situation demanded, for the temporary loan of Cerberus, that three-headed guardian of the dead, the great dog whose presence ensured that no soul entered or left without divine permission. Hades, apparently impressed by the audacity of the request and the politeness with which it was made, agreed, on one condition: Hercules could take Cerberus, but only if he subdued the creature with no weapons, only his hands. He wrapped his arms around all three necks at once. He held on until the dog submitted, and then he carried the three-headed guardian of the underworld up through the dark passages and out into the blinding light of the living world, walked him to Tiryns, and presented him to Eurystheus. Eurystheus hid in the jar for a very long time that day. The labors were complete. The debt was paid. The oracle's sentence had been served in full, and Hercules walked out of Tiryns with something that no decree and no payment could fully account for. Not absolution exactly, because the grief had not disappeared and the memories had not softened, but something adjacent to it, something that felt in the long afternoon of a life that had survived 12 impossible things, like the first real breath in a very long time. He was free. What he chose to do with that freedom, the adventures, the wars, the loves, the betrayals, and the strange and luminous death that waited at the end of all of it. That is the story that remains. And we are only just getting started. The Boun, with our Wansan, with our Wansan, the Boun, with our one, with our Ma, freedom, for a man like Hercules, was never going to look the way it looks for ordinary people. For most, freedom is rest. It is the absence of obligation, the quiet settling into the rhythms of a life chosen rather than assigned. It is the garden tended at one's own pace, the fire built for warmth rather than survival, the morning that arrives without a new, impossible thing waiting in it. Freedom, for most people, is fundamentally a stillness. Hercules did not know how to be still. This is not a criticism. It is perhaps the most honest and revealing thing the mythology tells us about his nature. The labors had been externally imposed, a sentence served, a debt discharged. But the truth that emerged from 12 years of confronting the impossible is that Hercules had not endured those challenges so much as he had been shaped by them. The man who walked out of Tiryns at the completion of his service was not a man seeking rest. He was a man who had discovered, in the furnace of those years, that motion was his natural state, that the horizon was where he lived, that a world containing injustice, monsters, tyrants, and suffering was a world that still had use for him, whether any king decreed it or not. And so he moved, not frantically, not without purpose, but with the deep and settled intentionality of someone who has made his peace with what he is. He was a hero, not because the oracle had said so, not because Zeus had ordained it, because it was the truest and most complete version of himself, and he had lived long enough and suffered enough to know the difference between what the world wanted from him and what he actually was. The years that followed the labors were, in many respects, the most fully human chapter of his story. One of the earliest and most illuminating episodes of this period involves a wedding feast, a drunken centaur, and a friendship so consequential that it would reshape the entire trajectory of his later adventures. His name was Pirithous, king of the Lapiths, and he arrived in Hercules' life in the most unpromising way imaginable, by raiding his cattle. The ancient sources describe Hercules setting out to confront this theft with every intention of addressing it forcibly, and then finding, upon actually meeting Pirithous face to face, that he admired him so completely and so immediately that the cattle were forgotten and a friendship was struck on the spot. This is one of the mythology's more endearing moments. Hercules, the invincible, the world shaker, charmed by a cattle thief with sufficient audacity to steal from him. It speaks to something consistent in his character throughout all the ancient sources, a genuine delight in people who were bold, who faced the world without flinching, who had the particular quality of courage that expressed itself not in aggression, but in a kind of cheerful, reckless confidence. He was drawn to that quality wherever he found it. He had it himself in abundance, and he recognized it in others the way musicians recognize pitch. Pirithous invited Hercules to his wedding. The guest list, famously, included centaurs. The centaurs, famously, got drunk and attempted to abduct the bride and the other women of the celebration. What followed, the Battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs, became one of the great set pieces of Greek mythological art, depicted on the metapiece of the Parthenon itself, frozen in marble for the ages. Hercules fought alongside his friend, and the centaurs were driven off, and the friendship between the two men deepened into the kind of bond that ancient culture recognized as one of its highest values, the bond between warriors who have bled together, laughed together, and chosen each other freely. He sailed with the Argonauts. This is a chapter of Hercules' life that deserves far more attention than it typically receives, because it places him in a different context than anything else in his mythology. Not as the solitary hero confronting monsters alone, but as one extraordinary figure among many extraordinary figures, rowing toward a common, impossible goal. The quest for the Golden Fleece assembled the greatest heroes of the generation. Jason, the leader and organizer of the expedition. Orpheus, the musician whose playing could charm rocks and rivers. Castor and Pollux, the divine twins. Theseus, by some accounts. Atalanta, the huntress, by some accounts. And Hercules, who was unanimously offered the position of leader and unanimously declined it, insisting that the honor belonged to Jason. This detail is worth pausing on. Hercules, on a ship full of heroes, deferred leadership. He had nothing to prove by claiming it. He was already the greatest among them, and everyone knew it. The offer of command was not a test he needed to pass, and so he chose, with the quiet confidence of someone genuinely unburdened by ego, to simply be useful, to row, when rowing was needed, harder than anyone else on the vessel. So hard, according to the ancient sources, that he broke 3 oars in succession simply by pulling with his full strength, and the Argo groaned with the effort of containing him. The voyage came to its first great interruption on the island of Mysia, where Hercules' beloved companion Hylas, a young man of remarkable beauty who had become his closest friend and constant companion in the years following the labors, went ashore to find fresh water. He found a spring, and the nymphs of that spring, enchanted by Hylas's appearance, drew him down into the water and kept him. He simply did not come back. Hercules searched. He called Hylas's name across the Mysian hills until the name became something closer to grief made audible than to a search. He refused to return to the Argo, the other Argonauts, with Jason in the unenviable position of deciding whether to delay the entire expedition for one man, even the greatest man alive. Eventually sailed without him, leaving Hercules still calling across the dark hills of an unfamiliar island for someone who was not going to answer. The mythology handles this loss with unusual gentleness. It does not resolve it neatly. Hylas is simply gone, and Hercules grieves him, and eventually resumes his own journey separately from the Argonauts. There is no monster to fight here, no labor to complete, no way to recover what was lost through strength or cleverness or persistence. Some things, the story insists, are simply lost. And even the strongest man in the world has to learn again and again what that means. He would have other companions, other friends, other loves. He married again, eventually. Deianira, daughter of the king of Calydon, came to him after one of the most peculiarly literal courtship contests in all of mythology. Her father had announced that she would go to whoever could defeat him in a wrestling match. Her suitors included the river god Hercules, and rivers, in the ancient imagination, were not simply waterways, but living, shape-shifting, immensely powerful entities. Hercules transformed during the match, becoming first a serpent and then a bull, cycling through forms trying to find one that could contain Hercules. Hercules broke off one of his horns, which became, in the symbolic logic of the myth, the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, an image of abundance born from a contest between a hero and a god over the love of a woman. He won. He married Deianira. He loved her, and she loved him, with a sincerity that the mythology treats carefully and seriously. This was not a marriage of convenience or arrangement. It was a choice made by 2 people who saw each other clearly, and it produced a life of genuine warmth alongside all the danger and complication that attending Hercules was always going to involve. During their travels together, they came to the river Evenus, where a centaur named Nessus worked as a ferryman, carrying travelers across on his back for payment. Hercules swam the river himself. Rivers presented no difficulty to him, and sent Deianira across with Nessus. Midway through the crossing, Nessus attempted to abduct her. Hercules, from the far bank, drew his bow. He fired one of his hydra-poisoned arrows, those instruments of terrible consequence that had followed him since the swamps of Lerna, and Nessus, fell dying into the river. But in his last moments, with the cunning and malice that dying creatures sometimes find, Nessus spoke to Deianira. He told her that his blood was a love charm, that if she ever feared Hercules' love was fading, if she ever feared he was turning toward another woman, she should anoint his garment with the blood, and his love for her would be renewed and permanent. She collected it. She stored it away in the private architecture of her fears and her love. She told no one. It was a poison gift dressed as a remedy, and it would wait there in its jar, patient as consequence always is, for the moment when fear finally overcame restraint. There were other adventures in these years, and the word adventures, for Hercules, encompasses a range of experience so vast that ordinary language struggles to contain it. He fought and killed the giant Antaeus, son of the earth goddess Gaia, who drew his strength directly from contact with the ground, and who had been killing travelers and collecting their skulls to roof a temple to his father Poseidon. Hercules discovered, through the accumulating logic of combat, that Antaeus grew stronger every time he was thrown down and touched the earth, and so he lifted him into the air and held him there, suspended between the earth and the sky, until the strength ran out of him and was gone. He sacked Troy, the first sacking, a generation before the famous war, provoked by King Laomedon's refusal to pay debts owed to both Poseidon and Apollo, and incidentally to Hercules himself, who had been promised divine horses in exchange for rescuing the king's daughter from a sea monster, and had been sent away empty-handed instead. Hercules did not forget debts owed to him. He returned with a fleet, took the city, killed Laomedon and all his sons save one, a young prince named Priam, whom he spared, and sailed away with the divine horses and the king's daughter Hesione, who had been given as a prize to his companion Telamon. He rescued Prometheus. This is perhaps the most mythologically significant thing Hercules did outside of the labors themselves, and it tends to be underemphasized in the popular telling. Prometheus, the titan who had stolen fire from the gods and given it to humanity, had been chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains as punishment, where an eagle came every day to eat his liver, and every night the liver grew back, and every morning the eagle returned. It was an eternal torment, and it had been going on for centuries or thousands of years, depending on which source you follow. Hercules shot the eagle with one of his hydra-poisoned arrows. He broke the chains. He freed Prometheus. The implications of this, a half-mortal man defying the punishment decreed by Zeus himself to free a titan who had given fire to humanity, are enormous, and the mythology handles them carefully. Zeus, by this point, was proud enough of his son's accomplishments that he permitted the liberation. But the fact that Hercules did it, that he looked at an eternal divine punishment and found it unjust and acted on that finding, speaks to something essential about his moral character. He did not defer to divine authority simply because it was divine. He deferred to what was right. And when the two diverged, he chose what was right. He wrestled Thanatos, death itself, to save the wife of his friend Admetus. A story of loyalty so complete and so characteristic that it deserves its own reflection. Admetus, the king of Pherae, had been fated to die on a particular day, and had found someone willing to die in his place. His wife, Alcestis, who loved him enough for that. Hercules arrived at the house as a guest, discovered what had just occurred, and without being asked, and without being instructed, went out to the boundary between the living world and the dead, found Thanatos in the act of claiming Alcestis, and wrestled him until death released her. He walked her back and returned her to her husband without, some accounts suggest, even fully understanding that it was the most extraordinary act of friendship he had ever performed. It was simply what the situation required. This is Hercules at his finest, not performing heroism for recognition or record, but responding to a need with everything he had, not calculating the cost or the glory, just acting, with the full and uncomplicated generosity of someone for whom the right thing to do has always been more or less obvious, and who has enough strength to do it, and so does. He founded cities. He established trade routes. He arbitrated disputes. He drew maps of the known world with his journeys and extended those maps with his audacity. He fought in the wars of others when justice demanded it. He refused to fight in wars of others when it did not. He accumulated enemies and allies in roughly equal measure, and he outlasted most of the enemies and cherished most of the allies in the way that people of genuine warmth always manage to do, regardless of how much damage the world inflicts on them. He was not always right. He was not always wise. He was sometimes impetuous, sometimes excessive, sometimes catastrophically trusting of people who did not deserve it. He was, in other words, human, in all the ways that his divine inheritance could not insulate him from being human. And the mythology never pretends otherwise. It does not present him as a saint or a symbol or a perfect moral archetype. It presents him as a man, enormous and complicated and trying, always trying, to be adequate to the scale of what he had been given and the scale of what he had lost. The horizon kept moving. He kept following it. He had carried grief with him for so long that it had become, in some sense, part of his stride, not slowing him down, but present, always present, and somewhere ahead of him, though he did not yet know its shape or its timing, was the ending that would finally make sense of all of it. Sai, Badine Pa, with C the heavened, the knock, and the donk canned after donk. A structural logic that you can feel building from the very beginning, even when you cannot yet see where it is going. A sense that the events being described are not random, not coincidental, not simply one thing after another in the arbitrary way that ordinary life tends to arrange itself, but that they are connected by something deeper than chronology, that they are moving towards something, that the beginning and the end, when finally placed beside each other, will illuminate each other in a way that neither could accomplish alone. The story of Hercules has that shape, and to understand it, to really feel the weight and the beauty of how it closes, we need to return to a small jar of centaur's blood that has been sitting quietly on a shelf in Deianira's house, while the hero has been moving through the world doing impossible things. It had been there for years. Deianira was not, by any measure, a small or fearful woman. The mythology is careful about this. She was brave, independent, capable of genuine courage in her own right. A woman who had lived alongside Hercules long enough to understand exactly what that entailed, and who had done so without losing herself in it. She knew who she had married. She knew the dimensions of what she had taken on. She had watched him go and come back, watched the world pull at him with its endless appetite for his particular brand of salvation, and she had built her life around those rhythms with the patient dignity of someone who had made a choice and intended to honor it completely. But she was human, and humans, even the bravest ones, are not impervious to fear. The fear, when it finally came in the form of a woman named Iole. Hercules had recently conquered the city of Oichalia, a campaign with its own long history, rooted in another unkept promise, another debt called in by Hercules with the full weight of his extraordinary capacity for reckoning. And among the captives he brought home was Iole, the king's daughter. She was young, she was beautiful, and she had, in an earlier chapter of the story that still existed as something unresolved in the architecture of Hercules' past, been a woman he had once sought to marry, a woman her father had refused to give him despite the terms of a contest Hercules had fairly won. The mythology is genuinely ambiguous about the nature of his feelings for Io. Some ancient sources suggest that Hercules loved her, truly and deeply, in a way that complicated everything else. Others suggest that the attachment was primarily one of honor, that bringing her to his home was a statement of restoration rather than desire. The truth, as it so often is in matters of the human heart, probably contained elements of both, and was not fully legible even to Hercules himself. What mattered was what Deianira perceived, and what Deianira perceived. Watching this beautiful, defeated woman arrive in her house, watching her husband's attention move toward that presence with a warmth she recognized and feared, was the thing she had been storing against. The fear she had held the centaur's remedy for all these years finally found its moment, and its moment was now. She took the cloth she had prepared. She anointed it with what Nessus had told her was a love charm. She sent it to Hercules as a gift, a ceremonial robe, richly made, intended to be worn during a sacrifice he was preparing in honor of Zeus on Cape Cenaeum. She sent it with love. She sent it genuinely believing she was doing something that would restore rather than destroy. She did not know what she was sending. She could not have known, because Nessus had lied to her in the way that the dying sometimes lie, with perfect knowledge of the consequences, with the cold precision of someone who understands that they will not live to see the damage, but finds comfort in knowing it will occur. The blood of a centaur killed by a hydra-poisoned arrow was not a love charm. It was the most concentrated distillation of destruction the world contained. It was not going to restore anyone's love. It was going to burn. Hercules put on the robe. What happened next is one of the most devastating passages in all of ancient mythology, and the sources that describe it do not look away from it. The poison, Nessus's blood, carrying within it the venom of the hydra that Hercules himself had created, activated the moment it came into contact with the warmth of his body. It did not behave like ordinary poison, which kills from the inside, which is invisible and quiet and merciful in its way. It burned. It adhered to his skin with a tenacity that made it impossible to remove. The robe could not be pulled away without taking the flesh with it. He was being consumed from the outside by something he had put on willingly in an act of devotion to his father's gods, wearing a gift from his wife. The great hero who had never been defeated by anything in the world was being undone by something sown with love and soaked in deceit. He was in tremendous, extraordinary pain. The ancient sources describe his cries carrying across the mountains, describe him throwing Lycas, the innocent messenger who had delivered the robe, into the sea in his agony, hurling him with a force that turned the man to stone before he ever struck the water. He tried to tear the robe away and could not. He was enormous and invincible and utterly helpless, and the mythology does not spare us this. It makes us sit with it. The greatest physical strength the world had ever seen, completely irrelevant to the particular nature of his suffering. There is no one to wrestle here. There is nothing to lift or break or hold. There is only the fire and the man inside it. Deianira learned what she had done. The ancient sources do not dwell on her reaction. They simply note that she took her own life before Hercules died, and the plain brevity of that notation is itself a kind of eloquence. There is nothing more to say about it. She had acted out of love and produced catastrophe, and she understood that with a completeness that left no room for anything that came after. Hercules, understanding that what was happening to him was not going to stop, made a decision. He would choose the manner and the place of his ending, to whatever extent that was possible. He made his way, still burning, still in the unimaginable pain of that dying, to Mount Oeta in Thessaly. He told his son Hylas to build him a funeral pyre on the mountain's summit. Hylas, devastated, could barely comply, but he built it as his father asked. Hercules climbed onto the pyre himself. He lay down upon it. He spread the Nemean lion skin, that first great symbol of his power, the armor that no weapon could pierce, that he had worn across 3 decades of impossible things, beneath him, and he used his great club as a pillow. And then he asked for someone to light the fire. His companions refused. One by one, they refused. They could not bring themselves to set alight the greatest man they had ever known, who was lying there asking them to end his suffering, who had saved more of them than they could count, whose loss was going to leave a shape in the world that nothing would ever adequately fill. A young shepherd named Philoctetes, some sources name him Poes, was the one who finally complied. He lit the pyre, and Hercules, in gratitude, gave him his bow, the great bow, with its hydra-poisoned arrows, the weapon of his most precise and far-reaching destructions. It was, as final gifts go, extraordinarily consequential. Those weapons would go on to be required for the fall of Troy a generation later, brought back into the world's great conflicts by the hand of the man who had the courage to grant a hero the death he asked for. The fire rose, and here the mythology does something unexpected, something that, after everything we have witnessed, the grief, the labor, the loss, the burning, feels less like a divine intervention and more like the world finally righting itself, more like the universe catching up to a truth it should have acknowledged long ago. Zeus looked down from Olympus at the pyre on Mount Oeta and declared that his son had earned what no mortal had ever fully claimed. Hercules had suffered enough. He had served enough. He had given enough. The mortal part of him, the part that could burn, that could grieve, that could feel the death of friends and the weight of impossible guilt, that part would be consumed by the fire. But the divine inheritance, the blood of Zeus that had flowed through him since Alcmene's 3 extended night, that could not be destroyed by any poison in any world. The clouds came down. Thunder moved across the mountain. And when it cleared, when the fire had done what fire does, there was nothing left of the suffering. There was no body. There was no ash that bore the shape of a man. There was only the empty mountaintop and the silence after lightning and the slow, certain knowledge among everyone who had gathered there that Hercules was gone from the world they could see and present in a world they could not. He was taken to Olympus. He was made immortal. He was reconciled, finally and permanently, with Hera, the goddess who had spent his entire life trying to destroy him, who had driven him to the worst moment of his existence, who had piled suffering upon suffering until he had become, through the very accumulation of what she had thrown at him, the most complete and extraordinary version of a hero the world had yet produced. The mythology states this reconciliation as a simple fact, without irony and without elaboration. Hercules and Hera were reconciled, and he was given her daughter Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth, as his divine wife. There is a profound and somewhat vertiginous logic to this. Hera's opposition had not broken him. It had, across the long arc of his story, built him. Every labor she had contributed to, every madness she had inflicted, every obstacle she had placed, all of it had been the very mechanism of his becoming. The enemy who hated him had been, without intending it, and without his cooperation, his greatest teacher. The suffering she intended as destruction had produced instead a kind of soul so tested and so tempered that it was, in the end, worthy of the heavens. This is the shape the story was building toward all along. Among the stars, the ancient Greeks placed him permanently. The constellation Hercules, kneeling, still in the posture of combat, one arm raised, hangs in the northern sky between the bright stars of Vega and Arcturus. It is not one of the most brilliant constellations. It is not the easiest to find, but it has been there, faithfully, every clear night for as long as people have been standing outside and looking up, and it will be there long after the last person who knows his name is gone. Some human things get to be that permanent. Not many. His children continued his line across the generations, the Heraclidae, the descendants of Hercules, who claimed kingdoms across the Greek world and whose mythological presence shaped the political geography of the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. The city of Rome would eventually adopt him completely, rename him with the Latin ease of Hercules, install him in their pantheon, not as a foreign import, but as a natural citizen of any culture, ambitious enough to deserve him. Alexander the Great, conquering the known world at a speed that still seems barely plausible, claimed descent from Hercules on his mother's side, and kept that claim at the center of his self-image. Roman emperors competed to associate themselves with his image and his attributes. Renaissance painters found him irresistible. Every subsequent century has found some new use for him, some new aspect of his story to reflect its own preoccupations back at itself. He became the patron of travelers and athletes. He became the symbol of moral choice. The story of Hercules at the crossroads, choosing between the easy road offered by vice and the difficult road offered by virtue, became one of the foundational parables of Western philosophy. The Stoics adored him. The Cynics claimed him. Poets from Pindar to Shakespeare to Tennyson found in him a vocabulary for things that ordinary language could not quite accommodate. The scale of human striving, the persistence of human suffering, the question of what we owe to each other and to ourselves when the world is asking everything we have. The reason is not complicated. When you sit with it long enough, it is because the story of Hercules is, at its core, the story of someone who was given more to carry than any person should be asked to carry. More grief, more obligation, more power, more consequence, and who carried it anyway. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without breaking in some of the ways that matter most, but consistently, persistently, across the full length of a life that never offered him the easy road and never once pretended that it would. He kept going because the world still needed something done, and he could do it. That is the whole of it. That is the center of the mythology around which everything else is arranged. Not the lion's skin, not the muscles, not the thunder of his father's name behind him. The simple, repeated decision to face the next thing, to meet the next impossible morning and discover, again, whether he was adequate to it. He always was. That is why we remember him, his line in. It fills the room it occupies completely, demands attention, insists on its own significance with the confidence of something that has not yet had to prove itself across time. Fame is what happens when the world notices you. Endurance is something else entirely. Endurance is what happens when the world keeps noticing you, long after every practical reason for doing so has dissolved, long after the civilization that first told your story has crumbled into archaeology, long after the temples built in your honor have become ruins that tourists photograph on their holidays, long after the language in which your name was first spoken has become a subject studied in universities rather than a tongue used in markets and bedrooms and prayers. By that test, the only test that ultimately means anything, Hercules is perhaps the most enduring figure the human imagination has ever produced. He has been with us for 3,000 years without interruption, not as a relic, not as a curiosity preserved in amber, but as a living presence in the cultural conversation of every era that has inherited him. He has been reinterpreted and reinvented and reclaimed so many times by so many different cultures with so many different needs that the accumulated weight of his afterlife is itself one of the great monuments of human intellectual history. And yet, through all of it, through every translation and transformation and appropriation, something essential has survived. Something that all those different cultures, reaching for him across their different centuries, were reaching for in common. To understand what that thing is, we need to follow him out of ancient Greece and into the world he went on to inhabit. The Romans, those extraordinary inheritors and systematizers of Greek culture, received Hercules with an enthusiasm that went beyond the merely theological. He was not simply added to the Roman pantheon, the way other Greek gods were absorbed and renamed and fitted into the existing divine bureaucracy. He was treated as something more specific and more personal than that. He was, for Rome, a patron of the active and strenuous life, of the soldier's discipline, the merchant's long road, the athlete's dedicated body. His altars stood at crossroads and city gates, in gymnasiums and military camps, in the places where effort was made and distances were crossed. He was the god you prayed to, not for protection from the world, but for the strength to move through it. The Romans understood something about Hercules that is easy to miss if you read his story too quickly. He was not a god of outcomes. He could not guarantee your arrival. He could not ensure your harvest or your child's health or the loyalty of your business partner. What he presided over was the attempt itself, the exertion, the willingness to pick up the burden and move forward regardless of what the day held in store. He was the divine patron of trying, which is perhaps the most genuinely useful thing a god can be. This is why the Roman emperors, across several centuries, reached for his image so consistently and so urgently, beginning with Augustus, who carefully constructed a public persona of effortful virtue, of a man who had taken the chaos of a dying republic and imposed order through sheer application of disciplined will. The iconography of Hercules became one of the primary vocabularies of imperial self-presentation. The lion skin, the club, the attitude of calm readiness. These images appeared on coins and on public monuments, in palace decorations and military standards, as a language that required no translation because every person in the empire had absorbed its meaning with the first stories they were ever told. The Emperor Commodus, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, took this further than anyone before or since, declaring himself to be not merely inspired by Hercules, but actually a reincarnation of him, changing his own name to Hercules, appearing in the arena in the lion skin, executing animals publicly to demonstrate his strength, and eventually ordering that all official documents bear the date as the year of the new Hercules, rather than the traditional calendar. This was widely understood, even at the time, as evidence of significant mental instability rather than genuine heroism. But it is also, in its extreme and distorted way, an illustration of just how powerful the template remained. Even a man losing his grip on reality reached for Hercules as the image of what a powerful man should look like. The mythology had become, by that point, the deepest available grammar of masculine authority in the Western world. Alexander the Great had made the same reach, more credibly and with considerably more self-awareness. He kept a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by his teacher Aristotle, under his pillow every night alongside a dagger. Homer being the supreme literary authority, the dagger being practical. But Hercules was always present in Alexander's self-conception as the ancestor who set the terms of what greatness looked like. When Alexander arrived at the legendary city of Tyre and besieged it for 7 months, one of his stated justifications was his desire to make an offering at the temple of Melkart, the Phoenician god, whom the Greeks had long identified as a version of Hercules. He was, in some sense, following his ancestors' footsteps across the world, using the older hero's geography as a map for his own ambitions. He was not the last conqueror to do so. The ancient world's fascination with Hercules survived its own collapse with remarkable resilience. When Rome fell and the long medieval centuries settled over Europe, the classical gods retreated from active worship, but refused to disappear entirely from the cultural imagination. They survived in manuscripts, copied by monks who found in the ancient texts a richness of human observation that transcended their theological framework. They survived in the imagery of medieval courts, where Hercules was frequently cited as a model of chivalric virtue, of strength placed in the service of the weak, of courage disciplined by moral purpose. The 12 labors were reinterpreted by medieval scholars as allegories of Christian virtue, each impossible task corresponding to a specific moral quality that the virtuous soul was called to develop. The story was translated into a different language of meaning without losing its fundamental shape. The Renaissance brought him roaring back into the full light of cultural prominence. In Florence, the Medici family, those extraordinary bankers and patrons who more or less invented the idea of using art as a form of civic propaganda, adopted Hercules as the symbol of the Florentine Republic, appearing on the official seal of the city. The reasoning was explicit and considered. Hercules represented the victory of civilization over barbarism, of order over chaos, of disciplined virtue over brute appetite. He stood for the Republic's aspiration toward a kind of ordered, rational, humane excellence. Michelangelo was commissioned to produce a Hercules sculpture for the city, which was completed and eventually lost. One of the genuine tragedies of art history, a Michelangelo Hercules somewhere in the centuries misplaced. Other artists found him irresistible in different ways. The ceiling of the Palazzo Farnese in Rome, painted by Annibale Carracci at the turn of the 17th century, placed the story of Hercules at its moral and compositional center. Rubens painted him repeatedly, with a physical lavishness that captured the overwhelming carnality and energy of the ancient conception. Dürer produced one of the most psychologically complex visual interpretations. Hercules at the crossroads, the Stoic parable, made flesh. A man caught between two futures, choosing with the full weight of self-awareness. The philosophers had written about that crossroads. The painters made you stand in it. Shakespeare reached for him constantly, using the name as a benchmark of physical excellence. Having characters invoke him as the absolute standard of what strength looks like, dropping him into plays set everywhere from ancient Rome to the Danish court. When Hamlet says that his uncle is no more like his father than Hamlet is to Hercules, the comparison does precise and instant work that could not be done any other way. Every member of Shakespeare's audience understood exactly what Hercules meant. The shorthand was 3,000 years old, and still completely functional. The Enlightenment recast him as a figure of rational heroism, of reason and virtue applied to the transformation of the natural world. The great encyclopedists of France, who believed with magnificent optimism that human intelligence properly directed could solve every problem the world contained, found in the Herculean model something that aligned beautifully with their own ambitions, to systematically address the world's difficulties, to tackle the seemingly impossible through persistent, methodical application, to hold up the sky long enough to get the job done. The Romantics, in the century that followed, took a different angle. For them, Hercules was most interesting in his vulnerability, in his grief and his rage and his terrible moments of destruction, in the gap between his power and his peace, which was permanent and aching, and never resolved in any way that would satisfy a person hoping for resolution. The Romantics recognized in that gap something they felt in themselves, the creative person's constant awareness of the distance between what they can imagine and what they can achieve, between the ideal they are striving toward and the flawed reality they keep producing. They found in Hercules a mirror for the particular suffering of sensitivity combined with enormous capability. He felt everything. He could do almost anything. And those two facts did not cancel each other out. They compounded. In the 20th century, he became, inevitably, the property of popular culture. Films and comic books and television series that stripped him to his most iconic elements and sent him on adventures designed for mass entertainment rather than philosophical inquiry. Some of these reinventions were trivial. Some were genuinely illuminating. The 1997 Disney animated film introduced him to an entirely new generation of children who would grow up carrying some version of his story in them, however simplified and cheerfully bowdlerized the version might have been. The Marvel comic book universe gave him a place in its pantheon of extraordinary beings, where he has coexisted for decades with gods and monsters and superheroes drawn from every mythological tradition the world produced, still recognizable, still reaching for his lion skin and his club, still constitutionally unable to walk away from a problem that needs solving. But underneath all of these layers of reinterpretation and reinvention, something has persisted unchanged. Something that every culture in every century, approaching Hercules from whatever angle its particular moment required, found waiting in the original story like a clean, clear signal beneath all the cultural static. It is this, that the measure of a person is not what they were given, but what they did with it. Hercules was given divine strength and human grief in equal measure. He was given power sufficient to reshape the physical world, and suffering sufficient to make that power feel, on the worst mornings, like a mockery. He was given a destiny so enormous that it crushed the ordinary life he wanted, the home, the children, the quiet evenings, and replaced it with something vast and lonely and irreplaceable. He did not choose this. None of it was chosen. It arrived, the way most of the defining facts of a person's life arrive. Before they were consulted, before they had the context to understand what was happening, before they had any say in the matter whatsoever. And he met it. Not once, not in a single heroic moment that could be framed and placed on a wall, but across the whole length of a life. Every morning, every new impossible thing, every loss and every labor, and every grief that could not be reasoned with, or outfought or outlasted. He met all of it, and he kept meeting it, and the accumulated weight of that persistent meeting is what the mythology has been carrying on our behalf for 3,000 years, because we need someone to carry it. Every culture that has reached for Hercules has done so from the same place. The place of ordinary human insufficiency, looking up at extraordinary human persistence and feeling. In that looking, something close to what the Greeks would have called catharsis. The release that comes from watching someone face what cannot be faced, and face it anyway. The recognition that is something deeper than admiration, closer to solidarity, closer to the feeling of not being entirely alone in the difficulty of existing. We reach for him because the world keeps presenting us with things that seem impossible, and we need to believe that impossible is a condition with a known cure. That the cure is not genius or luck or divine favoritism, but something available in principle to anyone willing to apply it long enough and seriously enough, and with sufficient refusal to stop. The cure is simply to keep going, to clean the stables, to cross the river, to hold up the sky for as long as the sky needs holding, and trust that someone will eventually come back and take it from you, and that the world will be a little more ordered for what you did in the meantime. The stars above Hercules' burning mountain have been turning since before his story was first told, and they will turn long after the last library that holds his name has turned to dust. The constellation kneels in the northern sky, arm raised, eternally mid-labor, and beneath it, in every century that has passed and every century still to come, ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances have looked up at that shape in the dark and found in it something that functions quietly and reliably, like courage. He is still there. He has never really left, and as long as there is something impossible that needs doing and someone willing to attempt it, there will be Hercules. Not in the marble and the myth exactly, but in the attempt itself, in the moment of decision at the crossroads, in the breath drawn before the impossible thing begins, in the willingness, above all, to begin. That is his enduring gift. That is the labor that never ends. And it is, of all the extraordinary things he accomplished across a life that defied every limit the world tried to place on it, the one that has proven most useful to us. Well, the one we could not do without. The in nature, past a seas,